This episode is brought to you in part by Ground News. More on them later. Between 1919 and 1939, the two most famous Jews in the world weren't politicians. They weren't religious leaders. They weren't even celebrities. They were scientists. And in 1932, they talked. That February, the world's eyes were on Geneva, home of the League of Nations, an international forum established after the First World War to enforce the decisions of the 1919 Paris Peace Conference and mediate international disputes with the goal of preventing another great power conflict. The League had struggled from its beginning. Though conceived by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, the newly elected U.S. Congress had rejected the Treaty of Versailles and avoided membership in a fit of isolationism. To the east, the Soviet Union spurned the League out of suspicion for cooperation with the capitalist West. But on this occasion, even the Americans and Soviets had come to Geneva. The conference would last almost 3 years. Its purpose, to honor the obligations of its founding charter by negotiating a global disarmament treaty. The League wasn't just a political forum. Its mission of international cooperation extended to the arts and sciences as well. And that summer, the League's International Committee of Intellectual Cooperation called upon its most famous member, Dr. Albert Einstein, to begin a public correspondence with any figure he wished on any topic he wished. The Geneva Conference had weighed on Einstein's mind for a long time. He'd held out hope for global diplomacy but had serious doubts, and thus his chosen subject would be the specter of war. As his partner in this correspondence, the most famous Jew in the world chose the second most famous. Albert Einstein was born in 1879 in Ulm and raised in Munich. The child of proudly Jewish but strictly secular parents, he attended a liberal Catholic school where he was subjected to relentless anti-Semitic abuse by his classmates, but never by his teachers. As part of a modified Jewish tradition, Einstein's parents took in a local medical student, Latvian-born Max Talmud, who became Einstein's tutor and introduced him to the world of physics. Einstein was particularly fascinated by the work of Scottish physicist James Clerk Maxwell, whom he later regarded as his greatest scientific influence. Despite rumors to the contrary, Einstein was an excellent student in math and science, but had an unfortunate reputation as a troublemaker. He almost certainly struggled with attention deficit disorder and chafed against the rote learning style and overt militarism of German secondary schools. In 1894, he dropped out just as his father's engineering firm went bust, first moving with his family to Italy before completing his diploma in Switzerland. In 1896, Einstein enrolled at the Federal Polytechnic School in Zurich, a low-status teachers' college which didn't even have doctoral programs. Completing his studies in 1900, he acquired Swiss citizenship and published his first paper in the journal Annalen der Physik. But he also graduated near the bottom of his class, which made it impossible to find a permanent teaching position. Instead, his school friend Marcel Grossman found him a secure, modestly well-paying job as a clerk in the Swiss Patent Office. At the same time, Einstein slowly and intermittently studied as a doctoral candidate under the University of Zurich. He completed his PhD in April 1905 with a paper on molecular dimensions. He didn't receive his doctorate until the following year, but by then, he'd already published 4 of the most important scientific papers ever written. In June, Annalen der Physik published Einstein's paper on the photoelectric effect, advancing a theory that light isn't a simple wave, but composed of discrete, massless particles, later named photons, which can physically interact with certain materials when emitted at certain frequencies. He followed this up with a paper on Brownian motion, demonstrating that the seemingly random movement of small particles suspended in water was actually consistent with the interactions of individual water molecules. After a century of debate, this paper proved that atoms were measurable physical objects, not just a mathematical convenience for understanding the physical and chemical properties of matter. Though it wasn't obvious at the time, the implications of this discovery would go on to play a surprisingly large role in Jewish history, but that's beyond the scope of this video. In September, Annalen der Physik published Einstein's hypothesis of special relativity, which suggested that the speed of light is constant relative to the position of the observer, casting doubt on the prevailing assumption that the universe had an objective frame of reference. This would mean that the physical properties of space and time were in fact the same thing, space-time, which was subjective and thus malleable. Unlike the first two papers, special relativity had yet to be proven. But building on that hypothesis, Einstein's paper on mass-energy equivalence proposed that mass and energy were just two expressions of the same thing. It's this paper that gave us the formula E equals mc squared. In order to make his calculations, Einstein was at least somewhat reliant on the work of his first wife, mathematician Mileva Maric, though exactly how reliant is a subject of debate. When he won a Nobel Prize in 1921, he gave her the prize money as part of their divorce settlement. He also didn't come up with these ideas out of nowhere. In 1922, Einstein proclaimed that he stood on the shoulders of Maxwell, and all four of the 1905 papers built on the work of contemporary scientists all over Europe and North America. But the fact that Einstein was able to advance all of these ideas to this degree and in such short order is genuinely amazing and worthy of recognition. Einstein's Annus Mirabilis made him so famous and influential that, in 1913, he was invited to return to Germany with the promise of a chair at the Humboldt University of Berlin, a seat at the Prussian Academy of Sciences, and the directorship of the new Kaiser Wilhelm Society. This was extraordinary for three reasons. First, Einstein had renounced his German citizenship in 1896 in order to avoid conscription. Yet this offer included a promise to restore it without requiring him to lose his Swiss citizenship. It's hard to imagine anyone else getting a similar deal. Second, due to gentlemen's agreements in Germany's academic establishment, Jews were only rarely hired for university positions without having to convert to Christianity. So being considered for even one of these positions was a massive achievement, let alone all three. The third reason would become clear a few months into his new roles when the First World War began. Einstein was a pacifist, a radical position to take in wartime Germany, especially in Prussia and especially among the middle class. When 93 prominent German artists, scientists, and intellectuals published an open letter voicing their support for the war and denying German atrocities witnessed in Belgium, Einstein became the only outside volunteer to sign an opposing letter denouncing the conflict. The following year, Einstein completed 4 more groundbreaking papers, all of them on the same subject. Seeking to reconcile special relativity with the established theory of gravity, Einstein's theory of general relativity posited that gravity isn't an attractive force unto itself, but the effect of a force by which matter bends the three-dimensional space and time around it. Unlike special relativity, general relativity should have been much easier to prove, and when the war ended, British astronomers Frank Dyson and Arthur Eddington did, simultaneously photographing a solar eclipse from 2 different positions on Earth to reveal that the sun's mass appeared to bend the light of the stars behind it. If 1905 made Einstein into the world's most famous scientist, general relativity made him into one of the world's most famous people. Even if most laymen didn't understand the significance of his work, they still understood that it was significant. In the 1920s, Einstein entered the cultural lexicon as a metonym for smart person. The end of the Great War also found Einstein in a radically different Germany. Under the Empire, only 2 German Jews had won a Nobel Prize, but when Einstein won his, he was just the first of 3 German Jews to win a Nobel Prize in the 1920s alone. Einstein had to be the best of the best just to get a foot in the door in his own native country, but without a monarchist elite enforcing their gentlemen's agreements, those days were over, at least for a while. Now, when Dyson and Eddington proved the theory of general relativity, it was a media sensation, and not always in a good way. In London, the Times proclaimed Newtonian ideas overthrown, an idea that somehow still stuck around, when in reality general relativity only added to Newton's theories. It's a common problem. The news media isn't always prepared to understand complex scientific concepts, let alone write about them in a way that'll be easily understood by the general public. I can relate to this problem because I had to write the script for this video. What's worse, this lack of comprehension can lend itself to political bias. That's why I use ground news. It doesn't just show you headlines. It goes deeper and shows you the bias, factuality, and ownership behind over 50,000 news sources from around the world. One of my favorite features is the blind spot feed. It highlights stories that one side of the spectrum covers while the other side mostly ignores them. Seeing those blind spots can completely change how you understand the news. Let's look at some recent stories in science. Most viewers won't be surprised to learn that the vast majority of recent science news is covered disproportionately by outlets that lean to the left or center. But if you look at this story about the American CDC restricting eligibility for COVID vaccines, we see not only that the story is disproportionately covered on the right, but that those right-leaning outlets basically accept the reasoning of Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. that the policy change is common sense, while those on the left make a connection between the policy change and the recent mass firings and resignations of senior CDC staff. Looking at Ground News' blind spot feature, we see that right-leaning outlets largely ignore reports that this mass departure was the culmination of months of internal political pressure, while left-leaning outlets ignore Kennedy's efforts to find a connection between antidepressants and mass shootings. This is the kind of insight you only get with Ground News. I talk about the Nobel Prize quite a lot in this video, so it's probably worth noting that Ground News has been endorsed by the Nobel Peace Center and is currently featured in an exhibit on media bias. Go to ground.news/Sam Aronow or scan the QR code to get 40% off the same unlimited Vantage plan I use. The link's also in the description. By subscribing, you won't just be getting a seriously useful tool, you'll be supporting independent media and helping me keep doing what I do. Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 in Moravia, but raised in Vienna, a city which he professed to hate but chose to continue living in for most of his life. Growing up in a large working-class family, Freud was in equal parts precocious and pretentious. He was particularly fascinated by ancient history, mythology, and literature. 23 years Einstein's senior, he'd been born into a Europe where Jewish emancipation was still the exception. So when Emperor Franz Joseph emancipated Austria's Jews in 1867, Freud was inspired to pursue a career in law. But once at the University of Vienna, he switched to medicine, believing the sciences to offer more opportunities for knowledge and discovery. Initially, this too proved a disappointment. His residency at the Vienna General Hospital was low status, low paying, extremely time intensive, and scientifically unproductive. Famously, he developed a decade-long cocaine addiction after researching its anesthetic properties, only for his work on the subject to be preempted by a colleague. Driven by the desire to make a better living and a bigger name, Freud redirected his energies to the exciting world of mental health. By the late 19th century, physics was such an ancient, established science that some physicists openly wondered how much more there was to learn about it. But mental health was basically brand new. As the Industrial Revolution brought more people into cities, the mentally ill had less access to support from their families or communities, leading medical doctors, mostly in France and the United States, to investigate how the brain worked and seek out mental health treatments that were more humane and evidence-based than, say, exorcisms or chaining people up in asylums. By Freud's time, it was already understood that many mental disorders were neurological, which is to say they were caused by physical damage or deformities in the brain itself. But that couldn't account for everything. In the autumn of 1885, Freud went to Paris to study under Jean-Martin Charcot, the most accomplished neurologist of his era, who'd attracted a fair bit of controversy for his studies on what was then called hysteria. Hysteria was a catch-all term for any kind of anxiety disorder. Patients suffering from it were otherwise healthy, functional citizens, and nothing seemed to be wrong physically with their brains. Accordingly, some doctors questioned whether it was even real, supposing that bored middle-class people were faking it for attention. But by treating patients through hypnosis, Charcot essentially proved that what had been called hysteria was in fact a range of psychological disorders, presumably induced by psychological trauma. Psychology was an established science by this time, but Charcot's ideas weren't well known in the German-speaking world. Luckily, Freud's friend and former teacher Josef Breuer began employing a modified form of Charcot's technique in talk therapy sessions with Bertha Pappenheim, a Viennese Jewish activist who suffered from what we'd now call dissociative identity disorder. Freud began applying the techniques with 4 patients of his own, and in 1895 he and Breuer published their research as Studies on Hysteria. But Freud soon began shifting away from Breuer's reliance on hypnosis in favor of what came to be known as psychoanalysis, a form of therapy to treat conscious behavior through the exploration of the unconscious. Over the next 25 years, Freud unleashed a torrent of publications culminating in 1920's Beyond the Pleasure Principle, in which Freud postulated that the human psyche was composed of 3 distinct parts: the id, which is responsible for a human's most basic evolutionary instincts like sexuality, aggression, and fear of death; the ego, which is responsible for translating the desires of the id into the real world through reason and intuition; and the superego, which acts as a moral and social filter between the id and the ego. By Freud's estimation, all human behavior, conscious or unconscious, could be understood as the product of interactions between these three agents. Just as with Einstein, Freud's work had an immediate and electric effect not only on the sciences but in popular culture, and Freudian themes were reflected all over the interwar period in art, literature, theater, film, and even business. You may have noticed that Freud and Einstein had a lot in common. They were both born in provincial towns but raised in big cities by financially unstable parents and driven by a desire for knowledge and understanding from a young age. Both men were intensely opposed to organized religion but remained culturally Jewish, and indeed credited their Jewishness as the basis of their nonconformism. Both men happened to be handsome, charismatic, and extremely talented communicators in a time when science communication wasn't particularly valued. Einstein was sometimes criticized for pushing physics beyond what the average person could understand, but we all know E equals mc squared, just like we know the id and the ego. Perhaps most significantly, both men accomplished the majority of their important work before the height of their fame, spending the remainder of their career more as figureheads while others took the lead in their respective fields. Though Einstein won the Nobel Prize in 1921, the following year's Nobel in Physics went to another Jewish physicist, Niels Bohr, for his work on the emerging field of quantum physics. Einstein always had a foot in the quantum world, and in 1925 he worked with Indian physicist Satyendranath Bose to develop Bose-Einstein statistics. But Einstein was a determinist. He believed that, with enough information, any physical behavior could be predicted. Otherwise, it would have to be the action of an animate being with a soul. The conclusions of Bohr and his Copenhagen group suggested that that simply wasn't true. While photons may not have had mass, they did have momentum, and that momentum couldn't be predicted by any mathematical means. The electrons in an atom could be predicted to be in certain orbits around their nucleus, but their exact location could be anywhere within that orbit at any given time. And at the same time Einstein was working with Bose, Werner Heisenberg discovered that it was flat out impossible to observe the position and momentum of an elementary particle simultaneously, that the very act of observing quantum behavior affected the data. Bohr debated Einstein mightily in the hope of winning him over to this new, uncertain way of thinking, but it was no use. It's often mistakenly said that Einstein rejected quantum mechanics, but he did reject the acceptance of randomness. Recalling the rationalism of the great Spinoza, Einstein wrote to fellow physicist Max Born,
"Quantum mechanics is certainly imposing, but an inner voice tells me that it is not yet the real thing. The theory says a lot, but does not really bring us any closer to the secret of the old one. I, at any rate, am convinced that he does not play dice."
But Einstein was wrong. His time at the forefront had ended. He would spend the next several years on tour as a visiting professor at universities around the world, giving lectures to packed audiences and rubbing elbows with politicians and celebrities. Freud faced greater difficulties. During the Great War, the doctor's iconic cigar habit had resulted in an oral cancer which he ignored for years. Only in 1923 was the cancer discovered for what it was, though his doctors refrained from telling him for fear that he might take his own life. 3 years earlier, his daughter Sophie had died in the Great Flu pandemic. In 1922, his niece Cecily had committed suicide, and during his treatment, he'd lose his 4-year-old grandson Heinele. In the meantime, his cancer was treated by a series of invasive surgeries, including a botched plastic surgery that nearly killed him. By the end, he needed an oral prosthetic to speak and eat. At the same time, Freud's work was consumed by disciplinary infighting. Back in 1912, his friend and protege Carl Jung had become his bitterest enemy, spinning off his own major school of psychoanalysis that challenged many of Freud's ideas. With Jung heading the International Psychoanalytic Association, Freud's loyalists formed a secret committee dedicated to maintaining their mentor's superior position in the field. But as psychoanalysis spread around the world, a lot of the IPA's newer members took issue with Freud's lax attitude towards medical professionalism. The criticism was especially loud in the United States, where psychoanalysis proved exceptionally popular, but which Freud intensely disliked. Eventually, the infighting reached the secret committee, which dissolved in 1924. In the years that followed, Freud, whose work always walked a fine line between hard science and philosophy, spent much of his remaining years applying the principles of psychoanalysis to his old fascinations of history, literature, and sociology. Einstein and Freud met exactly once, at a New Year's party in 1927, though they got along very well since they had so much in common. Einstein told Freud that he was a big fan of his writing, but privately, he was deeply critical of Freud and helped prevent him from winning a Nobel Prize of his own. Unaware of any of this, Freud believed Einstein's compliment betrayed a shallow understanding of his work. At the risk of psychoanalyzing, it's worth noting that Einstein's youngest son Eduard idolized Freud and was inspired by him to major in psychiatric medicine at the University of Zurich, only to be diagnosed with schizophrenia at the age of 21. He spent most of the rest of his life institutionalized, undergoing crude treatments that probably did more harm than good. If that had been my son, I probably would have written to Freud too. But there was another, more fortuitous reason why the two should have corresponded at this particular moment. Both men were vocally anti-war. As I said, Einstein had always been a pacifist. He loathed the absurd Prussian militarization of daily life that had epitomized his school days. He'd initially laughed off the League of Nations' plan for an arms treaty as an absurd fantasy. It was only the discovery of kindred spirits like Freud that got him on board. Freud's pacifism had been earned. Unlike Imperial Germany, the Austria of Freud's youth was much more renowned for its diplomacy than its martial prowess. It was also a much more open society towards Jews, especially in the military and civil service, to the point that Austria was often touted by the Jewish diaspora as a bulwark of toleration in contrast to the neighboring Russian Empire. There was anti-Semitism, to be sure, and it had caused Freud to doubt his own country on many occasions. But when the First World War broke out, he suddenly found himself rallying around the flag. The horrors of the conflict quickly brought him back to reality. He was ashamed, not only of his initial enthusiasm, but of the way the war had turned science into a weapon of national conquest and destruction, sowing the seeds of yet more hatred to be reaped by future generations. He elaborated on these ideas in 1930 with his book Civilization and Its Discontents, arguing that humanity's desire for social order is in perpetual conflict with its basest predatory instincts. Thus, on the 30th of July, 1932, Einstein wrote to him, "Is there any way of delivering mankind from the menace
of war? The normal objective of my thought affords me no insight into the dark places of human will and feeling. You, I am convinced, will be able to suggest educative methods, lying more or less outside the scope of politics, which will eliminate these obstacles."
Einstein saw the establishment of the League of Nations as the first practical step toward avoiding war, but he knew it was unsatisfactory. The League of Nations was really a league of rulers of nations, the small minority of policymakers who held the real power to make war and peace. And even if most of them wanted peace, you only needed one to make war. Einstein feared but suspected that civilization and its discontents was right, that human beings are ultimately self-destructive. What are we supposed to do about that?
Dear Professor Einstein, I expected you to choose a problem lying on the borderland of the normal, but then I realized that you did not raise the question in your capacity of scientist or physicist, but as a lover of his fellow men.
Contrary to their prior meeting, Freud was very impressed by Einstein's assessment. Perhaps he understood Freudian psychology after all. But where Einstein spoke of the problem of war as a conflict between might and right, Freud saw it as a problem of might and right converging. The more we expand our social circles, our states and alliances, the less necessary it becomes to resort to violence. Instead, societies create systems of law and order. But since not everyone in a society is equally powerful, law and order becomes a form of violence itself. Even when wars of imperial conquest and consolidation result in fewer wars, the wars that happen are bigger and more destructive. Freud was sorry to say that he agreed with Einstein, that humans are intrinsically torn between the desire to create and the desire to destroy. But he cautioned against Einstein's skepticism of the League of Nations. These were still early days. The League was much younger than either of them, and nothing like it had ever existed before. Freud believed that this new kind of multilateralism, by creating a truly global community with a sense of shared humanity could serve as an antidote to war. Not to eradicate it entirely, but at least to avoid it as much as humanly possible.
How long have we to wait before the rest of men turn pacifist? Impossible to say. Meanwhile, we may rest on the assurance that whatever makes for cultural development is working also against war.
Freud was 76 years old. He'd lived through a lot. He was willing to be patient for a world at peace, even if that meant that he wouldn't live to see it. Though Einstein and Freud wrote to each other in the summer of 1932, their correspondence wasn't published until the spring of 1933. It was a different world. That winter, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party seized power in Germany and began issuing a series of restrictions on the political and economic freedoms of German Jews. One of the 1933 laws purged Jews from government employment, including university faculty. At the time, Einstein was a visiting professor at Caltech in Pasadena. He'd anticipated the takeover for several months and had good reason to believe that he'd be killed or imprisoned if he attempted to return to Germany. Instead, he renounced his German citizenship a second time, sent for his second wife Elsa, and applied for refugee status in the United States, taking a permanent position at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton and spending much of his time as an advocate for his fellow refugees. He was later joined by his sister Maya and eldest son Hans Albert. The Nazi takeover also broke Einstein's pacifism. The disarmament conference in Geneva failed, and the better angels of our nature wouldn't stop German bullets. The only moral option was to resist, and if there was to be any hope of peace in a post-Nazi world, it would be through an organization like the League of Nations, but far stronger, a league that could enforce international law, by military means if necessary. His ideas had been tested. They did not pass scientific scrutiny. Both Einstein and Freud had the displeasure of watching news footage of their books being burned in Berlin. At the bonfire, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels proclaimed to the German Students' Union, "The age of Jewish intellectualism is now at an end. No longer would the Nazi machine be troubled by the inconvenient discoveries of Jewish scientists." At the time, Freud was still living in Vienna, but that would soon prove difficult. Following the playbook of the Nazis, Austria's ruling right-wing parties merged to form the fascist Fatherland Front before purging the opposition Social Democrats in a farcical 3-day civil war. Freud remained in Vienna for a few more years while his children and colleagues fled, but in 1938, when Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany, he was at last convinced to move. Much of his family had been living in Britain since the 1870s, and his son Ernst had joined them when the Nazis took power. Though Freud knew he would soon succumb to his cancer, he was determined, in his own words, to die in freedom. 4 of his sisters wouldn't be so lucky. Spending his final 16 months in London, Freud continued his practice and embraced his Jewishness even more in a final act of defiance. He died on the 23rd of September 1939, during the fall of Poland, still dreaming of a better world. A world that Einstein might yet live to see. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, David Ben Yosef, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, Dr. Chike, Andrew Ettinger, FC, Jay Fleischman, Osher Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Saul Cohn, Milk and Honey, David Safarian, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.